Welcome to a series of conferences on contemplative lifestyle. I am Father John Francis Sequeira, a Carmelite priest belonging to Karnataka-Goa province in India. The theme of our conference today is love of neighbor. The significance of the love of neighbor, both in Christian spirituality and in contemplative lifestyle, has to be seen in its totality. On the face value, it apparently looks as though love of God alone is all about contemplative lifestyle, because contemplation sometimes wrongly understood as all about God alone in Christ as an exclusive friend of the person. However, a correct understanding of contemplative spirituality confirms us that love of neighbor is the integral part of our deep love for God, or better expressed, love of neighbor is the authentic test to prove whether we are really contemplatives. In the words of St. John the Evangelist, how can you say that you love your God whom you can't see if you fail to love your brother whom you can see? 1 John chapter 4, verse 20. The role of love of neighbor in spiritual life has to be seen in the authentic understanding of who we are as persons. Aristotle defines a human person as a contemplative animal. That means human person lives in two realms, in the realm of nature and in the realm of the spiritual. Thus, human person has the gift of two worlds, empirical on one hand and spiritual on the other. Consequently, human soul has two natures, sensory and spiritual. The spiritual nature of the human person is aptly explained by the book of Genesis as a being created by God in his own image and likeness, Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, and breathed into the nostrils of humanity the breath of life, Genesis chapter 2 verse 7. Making us therefore his sons and daughters. We are ontologically united with God and God with us. Hence, each one of us are brothers and sisters to each other, belonging to the family of God. The Israelites were keenly aware of this fact, that they were the people of God, specially chosen and protected through the covenantal love. God made a covenant with Israel. I am your God and you are my people. If we are his people, we are united to each other in God. Hence, the book of Deuteronomy lays down rules and regulations how Israelites have to respect and protect each of their fellow men as though he and she were his brother and sister. The chapter 15 of the book of Deuteronomy is an excellent charter on brotherly love and sharing based on covenantal law. This inseparability of the love of God and neighbor moves us on to a new stage in the New Testament, and especially in the life and person of Jesus Christ. The life of Jesus is a clear manifestation of this inseparable bond between the love of God and neighbor. Jesus manifests God's love to humanity so much that he even laid down his life for his people. There is no greater love than this, that is to lay down one's life for his friends, not just because as an expression, but as a personal manifestation of his own death for humanity. The New Testament lays down clear principles of the invisible or indivisible unity between love of God and neighbor. All the four Gospels tell us that the sum and substance of the entire law and prophets can be summarized in the love of God and the love of neighbor. I quote, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord, and you shall love your Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and as your neighbor as yourself." Luke chapter 10, verse 27. However, the Gospel of Luke goes a step further to tell us the way ahead to love our neighbor through the parable of the Good Samaritan. A closer analysis of the story of the Good Samaritan teaches us that the Good Samaritan was none other than Jesus himself. It was he who came from outside, that is, from heaven, from the right side of the Father. He comes down from his animal and comes down on his knees at the fallen man, signifying God coming down from his heavenly throne and coming down on his knees of human nature, washing and binding the wounds of each one of us, pouring oil and wine on them, signifying healing and renewed joy and happiness. He lifts him up and placing him on his own animal, meaning he lifts man and made him to sit at the right side of the Father as sons and daughters of God, heirs and co-heirs of himself. And finally, taking him to the innkeeper, he says, "Take good care of him, and I will pay him in full on my return." The word tetelestai, uttered by Jesus, meaning "it is consummated," also means "I have paid in full." Thus, through his suffering and death, Jesus showed us how to love our neighbors. The parable concludes with the command of Jesus, "Go and do likewise." Jesus, therefore, is the only primordial sacrament of every relationship. It is in Jesus love of neighbor finds a new orientation and possibility of a new transformation. It is to this effect Jesus says in St. John, "A new commandment I give unto thee, that you love one another as I have loved you." John chapter 15, verse 12. With this commandment, Jesus abrogates the previous one. Love your neighbor as yourself. He knows that in our human nature, we are not able to love our neighbor with complete self-sacrifice, for we are selfish, sensual in the natural self. The only way forward in our quest for an unconditional love of our neighbor is therefore to be rooted in Christ, so that we may be transformed in the likeness of Christ, thereby able to love our neighbor as Christ loved each one of us. Basing ourselves on this authentic Christian understanding of love, we are now able to fathom better the entire teachings of the Church and on the Christian charity. Pope Benedict XVI and his encyclical Deus Caritas Est, and John Paul II and his entire teaching on the theology of the body are the two seminal treasures the Church possesses on the correct teachings on the subject under discussion in our recent times. Although it is an accepted fact that we humans are possessed with the gift of emotions, physical and psychological orientation, a mere gratification of these emotive and psychic orientations may not take us anywhere beyond our mere satisfactions of the needs and pleasures, or even what we call in today's parlance the therapeutic notion of love. Humanism can never be equated with spirituality. The vocation and destiny of man is not merely realized in the gratification of his physical, emotional, psychic, and cultural needs, rather, in the transformation of the natural needs unto the realm of the Spirit. Jesus, after washing the feet of his disciples, makes a very strong case of this divine love. He says, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash the feet of one another. For I have set to you an example, that you should do as I have done to you." The word example in Greek kathos has a dual meaning. It can be interpreted as source, or it can be even interpreted as model. In other words, God is both the source and model of our Christian spirituality and Christian charity. Saint Teresa of Avila, a great mystic of the Catholic Church, is a teacher par excellence on the love of neighbor. For Teresa, human relationships are guarantee of authenticity of one's progress and the true test of the love of God. She made this point most clearly in her book, Interior Castle, in the 3rd chapter of the 5th Mansions. Here, Teresa connects mystical union with mature fraternal love. In order to understand Teresa better, we first need to know the sharp distinction Teresa makes between psychological experience of the love of God and the spiritual reality of this state as such. There is, on one hand, the empirical awareness of God, the felt sense of his presence within, the experience that leaves no shadow of doubt that God is within and the soul is in God. Teresa calls this delightful union. This experience, although already is an altered state of consciousness, it is still the lesser part of the totality of the spiritual union. On the other hand, the ultimate spiritual union is a gift manifested in the conformity of wills, the will of God and the will of the human person. The surrender of the whole person to God through unrestricted and unconditional love. This spiritual reality is an altered trait of life, a state of new being, a transformation of the person caused by the inbreaking of God. This union with God's will, writes Teresa, is the union I have desired all my life. It is a union I ask the Lord for always, and the one that is clearest and safest. The 5th Mansion, chapter 3, number 5. However, what needs to be noticed is, for Teresa, the best indicator of the test of the conformity of wills is manifested in fraternal charity. Horizontal relationships are credible indicators of the vertical relationship with God. Teresa's mind is that we cannot know whether or not we love God, although there are strong indications for recognizing that we do love Him, but we can know whether we love our neighbor. 5th Mansions, chapter 3, number 8. In order to bring clarity on the topic, Teresa divides fraternal love into 3 stages. The first one, imperfect love. This love is based on the principle of sensuality, sensualidad. Saint Teresa uses the word sensualidad for any bodily and psychic component of human acts. For her, the words like sensual, tenderness, passion, and even weakness. The reference would be Way of Perfection, chapter 4, 12 to 13, and Way of Perfection, chapter 6, verse 2, are simply realities that show the element of human affectivity and sexuality as a natural but a limited quality in love. Imperfect charity is good, but it is imperfect because it is mixed with sensuality. Way of Perfection, chapter 4, verse 12. On the contrary, perfect love is not affected by any passion. Way of Perfection, chapter 4, number 13. This may seem like a repudiation of a natural component, but her mind is that the natural conditions of sensuality and passions are not disorders in themselves. They render love imperfect if they move the person in their own direction and not ordered and integrated into the movement of grace. Any natural independent motivation is a threat to grace, remember. Tenderness left to itself misleads. It nurtures empathy and sensitivity, Teresa observes, but it fails the person in the supernatural orientation. Hence, tenderness needs to be monitored and guided by the higher law of universal and transcendent charity after the example Jesus Christ himself. Way of Perfection, chapter 7, number 5. The second type of love is sensible spiritual. In sensible spiritual love, the sensible is the bodily or psychological factor, such as a family relationship or the good looks of a friend. The spiritual element is the grace of God received through contemplation. The distinctive note here is that the two sources pull independently to some extent in separate directions. In fact, the natural faculties are supposed to be an integral part of the spiritual love. It is the gift of the whole self freely shared, in which it incorporates the feelings and affections in concrete, down-to-earth ways in a splendid symphony of love. However, sensible love, says Teresa, deflects energy from the love of God, takes away autonomy, and allows the unmoved emotions to control one's choices. Note that it is imperfect not because it is warm, tender, or affectionate, but because it is not truly whole, free, and fully personal. In principle, any affection ordered by wisdom and prudence is acceptable, and when culturally tenable, can make a vast difference in the life of a person. Thanks to contemporary lifestyles, Christians tend to foster warm, expressive relationships with visible demonstrations of affections. Current cultures appreciate the importance of any tangible expressions of giving and receiving love. Saint Teresa would appreciate all these expressions, provided they are all full expressions of a well-integrated personality and flow automatically as an expression of God's unconditional love. For Saint Teresa, any human relationship should be based on incarnational spirituality. Human beings are not created as and destined to be angels, but human beings fully human and fully divine. Saint Teresa would love the concrete person in his or her singularity. Remember, the universal love of charity governs but also integrates the real with the secondary considerations of blood, nationality, common interest, and other qualities. For St. Teresa, spiritual love is not antiseptic, cold well-wishing, or a pure will act. On the contrary, she is a strong proponent of intimate friendships that are the result of a personal attraction and preferences, provided these particular friendships are founded in spiritual love. They must never compromise the primacy of the spiritual dimension. This means that the ultimate rule for the love is God. The human contours of the love are not to displace or weaken this essential orientation, but the place God in love is the only ultimate orientation, not its penultimate reality. The latter quality embraces all the particular considerations which make each human love different, even unique. The resulting particular friendships do not threaten universal charity, since the greater love of God is never subordinated to the lesser human attraction. The third stage is the spiritual love. The primacy of the spiritual love over the other types of love has to be found in its origins. The spiritual love originates in the personal experience of God's love, freely received and deeply experienced by a person in contemplation. As we all know, the spiritual quality of all grace love for others, imperfect as well as perfect, as its source in God's prior gracious love. First letter of John, chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. However, the perfect form, the spiritual love, is nurtured in the high ground of contemplation. Saint Teresa writes, "Now it seems to me that those whom God brings to a certain clear knowledge love very differently than do those who have not reached it. This clear knowledge is about nature of the world, that there is another world, about the difference between the one and the other, that the one is eternal and the other a dream, or about the nature of loving the Creator and loving the creature." Way of Perfection, chapter 6, verse 3. It has to be keenly observed that for Teresa, the depth of fraternal love is in some way correlative to the growth in prayer. Therefore, perfect love and contemplation go hand in hand. This truth is dealt deeply by Teresa in Interior Castle. She explicitly attributes the same theological structure to the prayer of quiet. The first fully infused contemplation, as she had previously given spiritual love in the Way of Perfection. Teresa contrasts the discursive prayer of the first three dwelling places with the contemplation that characterizes the fourth dwelling place and the subsequent stages. We know that discursive prayer or meditation as a double source of nature and grace, contemplation a single source in God. The prayer of the beginners is thus the counterpart of the sensible spiritual love. A contemplation is related to pure spiritual love. Fourth Mansion, chapters 1 and 2. The fact that the same dynamic is at work in prayer and fraternal charity allows us a legitimate transposition of prayer to the subject of human relationships. As we all know, that the ultimate foundation for any Christian relationships is in the gift of God's self-communication, a reality easily associated with prayer and no less really connected with human love. Friendship and community are as much gifts of grace as are the graces of prayer. In both areas of prayer and human love, The ultimate concern is the already present God within. In prayer, the goal is to allow the indwelling presence to transform the person. In human love, the object is to let the divine love, which has been received to grace, find its expression in symbolic ways. It is one's self-knowledge before God, which in turn facilitates the discernment that recognizes and fosters what the Spirit desires, both in the spiritual and in the natural. It is in this framework the physical, psychological, and the social formation takes place with enlightened understanding and greater realism and honesty. In other words, the growth in the Spirit attained through contemplation alone can elevate the human person to the supernatural structure of Christian life. In final analysis, what we have come to conclude is that the love of neighbor is the authentic expression of our authentic love for God received through contemplation. On one hand, our struggle to build such authentic friendships augur the conditions for contemplation. Thus, Saint Teresa would place humility, detachment, and love of neighbor as the three important conditions for the growth of contemplation. On the other hand, when we reach the conformity of wills in the love of God, all imperfect tendencies of love are purified, and the person would be able to love one's neighbor with the heart of Christ. Thus, it is in this economy of means and ends Christian perfection is finally attained. Let our prayer be today, Lord, purify our hearts to love you as you loved us first. Amen. God bless you all.